I mean, I have a little bit mixed feelings, but I think that, I mean, if we keep a few pieces, I think that's very, very good. And it's not really up to us only. But I'm not sure renovating pieces is the right way to go.
Good day, Jacob.
Good day, good day.
How are you?
I'm fine. How are you doing?
Yeah, fine. I mean, it's been a while. I think it was last summer we met, right?
Yeah.
In Stockholm.
In Stockholm was it in May, June, I think?
I think it was May, yeah.
Yeah.
You have watched all new episodes from...
I haven't watched all of them because I have been so busy with the teaching. So I watched the ones when it was up, when it was Christmas, the ones who were not in German, and the other ones I haven't been able to watch yet. But next week it's the so-called sports holiday. So then I will have some more time to kick back and relax. But I have almost all of my teaching in the first half of the semester this year. So it's been quite exhausting teaching experience. I like teaching, but it's, sometimes it's just a little bit too time consuming. So
yeah. So let's introduce you a little bit to our readers and listeners. Most of our readers on ilovegraffiti.de probably know you from back in the time when you did this Underground Productions magazine, right?
Yeah, probably many of them know me from back in those days. If they still remember that magazine, I guess it was almost 10 years since we stopped doing it. So I guess there is at least one generation who grew up without it, but we were one of the most longest running magazines at the time.
Mm. And yeah, that's how it all started for you. I mean, yeah, your career as journalist and writer and stuff like that, that's all started with the magazine, right?
Yeah, that's more or less so. I mean, I had a background in writing graffiti already back in '86, but we started the magazine in 1992. And that was my career in writing about graffiti rather than writing graffiti.
Was it the first Swedish graffiti magazine, Underground Productions?
No, it wasn't actually. There was a few other ones, but we were the ones that were the first that was releasing issues on a regular basis. And I think there was the magazine called Kilroy, which was before us, and also Trains/Sneart, which was made by Nug and Eamon and a couple of other guys, I think. They were very small though, and more really, really fanzine kind of magazines. But Kilroy was a quite serious magazine as well, but we tried to do a magazine already back in '89. Because I met Sebster, Chintz and Lumit in the summer of 1989, and they brought with them a couple of copies of the 14K magazine, the Swiss magazine, and that was the first time I ever saw, a graffiti magazine, and I remember being very impressed. Unfortunately, I lost I think I got 2 copies of the magazine, but none of them are left anymore.
89 was the time when also CMP did his...
Fantasy,
right?
yeah, Fantasy. That was, I think that was about the same time. There was a bunch of magazines coming out at about the same time. A little bit after came XG magazine, and they were also, and Bomber magazine was already out. I think already 1990 or something.
Yeah, it was 90, I think. Yeah.
I had never seen them, but I know that there was. I heard about the IGT, International Graffiti Time, or the International Get Hip Time, so it was later renamed. But I hadn't seen it until '93 or something.
So basically, it all started as a graffiti writer, and then in the late '80s, you started to document the whole thing in photos, photography, text, writing, stuff like that.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. I usually count myself as the second generation writer in Stockholm, so I was not a part of the first generation. So it was already a scene when I started back in '86. The first one started '83, '84. So, and I was, I guess, too young, but I was interested already back then. But I started writing and socializing with writers in 1986. So I usually count that as my starting time. For me, graffiti is not only an art form, but it's also a social context. And if you're just a watcher, you're not, not a part of the scene.
I mean, that was basically the reason why we met you to have an interview for our series, because you're pretty much into, of course, your generation and also what happened before. You did some research. You showed us a lot of like articles, newspaper articles and stuff like that. So you're probably one of the few who actually can tell details about Swedish graffiti history.
Yeah. There is probably people who know more about certain aspects and certain places and certain periods, but I think have a pretty good overview over a lot of the time. And since I am now, perhaps I should mention also, today I'm a professional art historian, so I work and teach art history. And one of my ideas when I started writing about graffiti in an art historical context was to not work the way I had been working before, because when we started the magazine, we immediately, of course, started interviewing our contemporaries, but also the pioneers of the scene and the pioneers of the Swedish scene in other cities. So I did a lot of interviews, but now I wanted to, do as an art historian, I wanted to, because there was quite a lot of things written about graffiti from, not primarily an art historical, but from different academic contexts. There was, we had a lot of sociologists, criminologists, cultural historians, etc. A few art historians as well. In Sweden, we had Staffan Jakobsson in Lund, and we had Johannes Stahl in Germany. So there was a few, but my idea was to not write. A lot of the research was made from the position of an outsider looking into this fascinating, strange subculture. So my idea was to more look at the fascinating, strange mainstream reactions on these subcultures. So looking from within the subculture and take the subcultural history somewhat for granted, and then look at what has been written about it in the media. That's why I have so many articles. I've collected a lot of articles on graffiti from different writers, and also going through the archives.
You're actually holding a PhD in art history from the Stockholm University, right?
Yeah.
I have a question about that. How hard was? I mean, you defended this in 2014. This was like 6 years ago, right?
Yeah.
How hard was it to defend this actually on your thesis? The PhD thesis? How hard was it to actually do it and to defend it?
I mean, defending it was not that hard. I think the problem was getting into the system. I had a lot of people who were from art history saying, yeah, this sounds interesting, but since it's not really art, shouldn't you be doing this in media studies or in cultural history or something? They had all these different ideas. So that was more difficult, convincing people that this was a research-worthy topic within an art historical context. And you should also remember at the time, this was 2007, 2008, so that was 10 years after Staffan Jakobsson had defended his thesis, so it was kind of not new and hot anymore. It's already been done, and what else could be said about it? But once I was inside the system, I didn't feel that was... I felt a lot of support and an interest into my project, and I think the defense was quite well attended by art historians, both from my university and other universities. So there was a great interest. I think now perhaps it's again a little bit of a problem because I'm continuing researching graffiti. I'm researching some other things as well, and I'm also looking into the early European hip hop history and the negotiations between hip hop and graffiti and stuff like that. But I think some people think, well, now you've done graffiti, now you should do something else. But I still feel that there is a lot of things to research within this context. But yeah, so that's. But it wasn't that hard. I mean, I got some tough questions, but everybody gets tough questions when you defend your thesis. And yeah, I think the interest. I mean, the toughness is. It would have been tougher. It would have been at like 25 people watching. I've been on those defenses as well. Then you really feel that there is nobody actually really interested in what you are doing.
Did they knew anything about it before? No. But you just started from the scratch when you defended it?
The ones who were my opponents, so to say. Yeah, all of the ones who are opponents to the thesis, they have had the thesis 3 weeks on beforehand, so they have read it. And I really felt that the main opponent, he did a really good job. I think he had some really tough questions, and I still think he pointed out some things that I kind of missed. But he also gave a very, very thorough and well-prepared presentation of the thesis. That's how it's done in Sweden. So the opponent first have like 20 to 30 minutes to present the thesis and the research results and everything. And then they after that you can say this was reasonable, or I would say that this or that, but I had nothing to remark on in his presentations. And after that I felt kind of sure, because whatever comes up, we have read the same book. And that sometimes that the opponent kind of misinterpret what you have been doing, and then it's a problem of course, because then you haven't been clear enough on what you're doing. But I got some criticism regarding the power relationships, and I think that was something I could have spent more time on between, especially if you look at the U.S. Graffiti and the art world context in the 1980s. But on the other hand, I was into that, but since I came from the scene, I didn't want it to be like a kind of pro graffiti. I wanted to be seen as something that is, in a sense, if not objective, at least thorough and with a good cause for the choices I make. And if I would start to go into power relationship, I felt that at least some people would perhaps trying to defend graffiti and graffiti writers, and that was not what I was interested in. But it could probably have been done a little bit sharper.
The thesis is called The G-Word, right? This is this is the title, and you also published a book with the same title, right?
Yeah.
What is is it possible to explain in short what the G-Word thesis is about?
Yeah. I mean, the book and the thesis is more or less the same thing. In Sweden, we have a system where you have a final defense, 1 year to 8 months before you defend a second time. And when you defend the second time, you defend a book. But the second time, it's more of a formality, because you're not supposed to be flunked, because it's already published. So the big defense is actually the first defense, which was almost a year before in my case, and that was a much more tough beating. But the G-Word, I would say, was about different negotiations on what graffiti is and how it should be understood in different historical and cultural contexts. I was primarily interested in looking at graffiti, since I'm an art historian, at graffiti as an art historical subject. And so therefore I started with what has been already quite heavily researched, but from what I thought not with an art historical point of view, that is the negotiations between the graffiti subculture and the more established and institutional art world in New York in the 1970s and 1980s, where I tried to show, because it's usually, especially in mainstream art history, described as a craze, as something that happened in a short time during the 1980s primarily. And I wanted to give this kind of broader and longer history. I mean, I went through material. There was an ongoing institutional graffiti scene from the more or less ongoing since the early 1970s until the early 1990s. That's when I mean, it's probably ongoing longer, but I was looking at the material 1972 to 1992. And there is like 1 year where I couldn't find at least one graffiti exhibition in New York. So I would say that there was this kind of like ongoing scene. So, I mean, a lot of people, I think both from within the scene and especially from within the art world, would say that, you know, graffiti is not for being painted on canvas. Graffiti should not be painted. It should be in the public realm or in the on trains or on walls in the public realm. And I think that, I mean, of course, that is the main. The masses of graffiti that is done in the public realm. But I thought, since people have been doing black books, people have been doing canvases, the graffiti scene is not only what's done the most, but also smaller things or smaller aspects of the field are equally important in the larger picture. So that was one of them. Yeah. And then I also looked at the use of graffiti as a political symbol in the West as a part of the Berlin Wall, how the Berlin Wall was interpreted in the English spoken media. So that was another. And then half inadvertently, I came into looking at zero tolerance politics in Stockholm because I didn't want to do that because it was too close to myself in many senses, and I was so tired of the zero tolerance politics. But I just realized that it would be very strange sitting in Stockholm in 2009 to 2014, looking at graffiti on the Berlin Wall as a political symbol, looking at graffiti in New York in the 1980s and 70s without acknowledging, you know, the war going outside of my university window, because that would be a little bit too much of an ivory tower. I mean, Stockholm had at the time what was probably Europe's harshest anti-graffiti politics. So that was.
Is this war still going on?
I mean, it has eased up, I think, a little bit. Several different reasons, but I mean, it's still. I think even after I defended my thesis, there was the law on graffiti has been changed 2 times. One in the mid 2000s, and one about 3 or 4 years ago. So it's now more or less mandatory to have prison for graffiti, depending a little bit how you interpret the law. Yeah. But they made a writing that it said that if you are doing damage prepared, if you prepare yourself for doing damage, then it should be seen as a gross crime, which could give you up to 5 years imprisonment. which is, I mean, equal to gross grovt vapenbrott. You know, armed. Prepare yourself to be armed with heavy weapons. So that's the kind of like, which is, I mean, and preparing for graffiti or preparing for vandalism, they count at you are bringing your markers or your spray cans with you, leaving your home. That is a preparation. So you can do almost nothing, but if you've been prepared, it would be seen as gross damage.
Yeah.
So
I mean, when we has been to Stockholm last summer or early summer, for me personally, it really felt like, okay, the war is pretty much over.
Yeah.
But when we left Stockholm, I would say it has changed again.
Oh.
Because, I mean, there's so many Instagram profiles that disappeared and blah, blah, blah. So I also heard some stories. As far as I know, it's getting started again.
Yeah. It goes up and down. I think it was also, I mean, the war is different now because the war during the zero tolerance, I think it had several different facets, which one of them are not back, the one was that's the city of Stockholm had a paragraph that said that they should not support any kind of legal graffiti. And that aspect, I think, is not that is not back. But I think there is some severe sentences for people doing illegal graffiti, and I think that never changed. And it's also, I mean, we have a very, very controlled public space where very small offenses of disturbance is seen as very, very severe acts of disobedience. So that's I think, yeah, and there's been during the winter a few major arrests, and another of the aspects of the zero tolerance was that they actually hired the Vandal squad in Stockholm consisted. I don't know how it looks exactly at this moment because I haven't looked into it, but they were like between 2 and 5 police officers, and then there were between 25 and 40 security guards that more or less worked as police officers, which is that's a quite big Vandal squad for a city with less than 2 million people, or the region with less than 2 million people. The city is, I think, 1 million. And I think those guards are still working as a part of the Vandal squad. And it's usually them who do the arrest. It's not the police. It's usually the guards.
Yeah. The Underground Productions magazine, right? When and why did you actually stop that?
Yeah, I think there was several different reasons, but I think the main reason was that we didn't have the resources or energy to do it anymore. It was never anything we got any money from, and becoming more and more adult, you actually have to make a living on what you're doing in a I mean, if you're in your 20s and up to the 30s, I guess at least for me it was I had a day job where I could earn my living, and then I worked between 10 and 20 hours a week with the magazine. But when I got a little bit older and started doing other things, it wasn't possible anymore. And I think it was the same for others. I mean, we didn't stop completely since, I would say, to some extent, the magazine grew into Document Press, the book publisher. So in that sense, the magazine lives on, but now as the book publisher. I mean, Document Press was started by Malcolm Jacobson, who did his books, They Call Us Vandals, that came out in late 1999, even if it's dated 2000. And then he started distributing that book through the network of shops that we built up from the magazine. And then eventually, I think I started studying at the university, and Tobias and the other guys who were on a group, they continued working on Document and started publishing books, which had another type of economy, so you could actually work on it and get a small, if not large salary, but a salary. So I guess that's why. So it was throughout the 20-ish years, I think it was 21 years or something, it was always a labor of love doing it. We didn't get any economic benefits from doing it. So,
but would you say that there's no market for such a magazine anymore, or what is I mean,
there was never really a market in a sense. There was a market, I think, but there was very few magazines that lasted more than a few issues because of that. There's so much job in doing a magazine, I guess. But there was a few. And then I know that Style File is still existing, but they started 10 years after us at least. And they also have a distribution network. It's still Publicat, right? But I enjoyed the years, and I really liked doing the magazine and communicating through the magazine. Yeah, I would say there were several different reasons why we didn't continue doing it, but the main thing, we didn't have the time or energy or resources.
But the publishing house Document is still...
Yeah, it's still working with a lot of different books, and I think it was about the same time as we stopped doing the magazine. We decided to not do another issue. Was about the same time as Document accepted to publish my thesis. So it also was kind of a little bit of a beautiful that I, as one of the founders of the magazine, published my art historical thesis on Document Press that was founded also on the structures by the magazine. I think Tobias wrote something like that also in his... And then we met up, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, Tobias, Malcolm, and I, who we all three were part of the first group founding the magazine. And we packed down all of the magazine, all of the pictures, all of the DVDs, all of the other magazines we had collected, everything, and put in boxes and donated it to the National Library of Sweden. So it's archived now in the National Library, but nobody is allowed to look at some of the material is restricted, so nobody's allowed to look at it in 50 years. Since we also gave them all of the letters and stuff we had gotten, and it's still, some of it is still sensitive material, so nobody's allowed to look at it in the upcoming 50 years. After that, I guess it shouldn't be a problem.
The problem with the magazines, I think, is that most of the graffiti magazines that are on the market still are mostly focused and dedicated to train writing, right?
Yeah.
And my opinion, train writing at the moment is a little bit boring. I mean, I still love it, and I love benching and stuff, but those magazines like Underground Productions or also Style is coming not out that much anymore. And, you know, there's a few magazines that I miss.
Yeah.
And Underground Productions.
I'm happy that it's missed. And we enjoy, I mean, already from the start, we had the kind of ambition to actually make journalism. And we learned, none of us were educated journalists when we started, so I enjoy looking back sometimes. I'm still, you know, when I have a little bit, and I'm not teaching that much, I'm sometimes take an evening and take down my own. I have a pretty large collection also of other magazines and go through, but I enjoy especially the early ones like Explicit Graphics and our own one, to see how graffiti journalism is kind of developed in front of its readers. We could barely write a complete sentence when we did the first articles, and in the end, I think we at least did, you know, some interesting essays and stuff, and I also did some of my, I mean, in the end, what I primarily was doing was the series called Top of the Line, where I actually tried to combine art historical and art critical methodologies writing about graffiti pieces, because that was, I mean, so much of the graffiti journalism we had been doing, and what graffiti journalism generally does is interviewing writers. And I mean, that is, of course, highly relevant, especially since there are so few interviews with writers in mainstream media. But I also enjoyed, you know, writing about the objects rather than the people doing the objects, trying to analyze them from an objective point of view.
Mm. Have you recognized that a lot of graffiti writers at the moment doing self-publishing books at the moment?
Yeah, and I also realize when I meet some friends and I look at the Instagram that there are a fanzine scene as well with self-published or really, really underground magazine that are perhaps released in 25, 50, 150 copies. Yeah, and it's super interesting, but it's, again, we were out to have not as broad as possible, but we had an idea of trying to reach a lot of readers. We were an exclusive magazine in many senses, but it was not our goal to be exclusive. And I think a lot of the self-published have a goal of being exclusive. I think I completely respect that. It's really cool. I every now and then I buy one of these numbered books or fanzines by specific artists, and they a little bit remind me, not in any obvious, but in the feeling of reading them, they remind me a little bit of before the fanzine era in the early 90s. There was all of these Xerox copied sketches that circulated around Europe. I remember seeing sketches by Lumit or Motu or Bates, etc., and also Swedish writers. They were not published as fanzines. They were more like this kind of copy of a copy, the kind of Style Wars. But it was a really cool, glimpse into something else, and I get a little bit of a feeling when I read some of these.
Yeah. Actually, I met a writer yesterday, like old-fashioned writer from back in the days, and he told me that after all those years now in social media, it happens sometimes to him that he looking at an analog photo and then he tries to enlarge with the fingers.
Yeah, a similar experience. Yeah, realizing that you cannot actually zoom in the same.
Yeah, especially because when you browse Instagram, you know, when it comes to a wall with a style, that's fine. But when there's a big wall production where it's very little details, you know, then you start to scale it, and it's almost impossible to look at it the same way as you look at it on a photo, you know. It's a whole different thing. When it comes to like detail, for example, the book that just came out, Svensk Old School Graffiti. This was the first time for a long time I have actually browsed the book for like 2 hours watching on photos. You know, it was I don't know. I'm very into social media and websites, etc. So that was also the first time I really looked at photos for longer than like maybe a minute or two. You know.
Yeah.
It's I don't know. What do you think about the book, basically? By the way.
Yeah, I thought it was super interesting, even for me, who was a part of the years that it chronicles primarily. I mean, there are a few pieces that are before, but the bulk of the book is, I would say, 88 to 92, which is a time where I participated in the scene. But they actually managed to dig up a lot of things that I haven't seen, and a lot of things that new pictures or pieces where I had seen but I forgot about. So I think it was super interesting and very well done. I really enjoyed it. And they managed to dig up things from Gothenburg, which I knew some Gothenburg writers, but they actually managed to get some pieces that I'd never seen. I've been following the group as well. I mean, I thought it was super interesting. It started as a Facebook group where people posted old school pictures. But for me, it's a little bit strange to that they delimit it to 92, because for me that's not old school. But I guess that's dependent on my position. But I would say the old school is before 89 or 89. The 90s is not old school for me, but I mean, I'm realizing that I meet writers who are in the 20s. Of course, they weren't born, so obviously 90s are also old school. Yeah,
the only thing that I think that was a little bit confusing is the order in who's on what side. I mean, sometimes there's Dizzy is somewhere in the middle, and then another guy is in the end, and he should be. I didn't really get the order.
I think some of it. I mean, I didn't think about that, but it's not very well structured. But I thought that's also a kind of a strength in it. It's more of an intuitive read than this kind of like. I think it was a strength in have neither a geographical nor biographical nor chronological order. I think it's a strength. I mean, and I remember one of the writers I used to do a lot of pieces with, who I remember as a good writer, but I haven't really realized how good he was. It's Bonus. He's really one who gets a lot of shine in the book, and I really think that was very well deserved. So it's a cool, and there's I enjoyed it a lot, and it's
especially it came out more or less the same time as the episode, the Stockholm episode in our series. More or less the same time. It was very interesting and good.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people in Stockholm were also happy. I remember one of the things actually I remember from when we started interviewing writers in Stockholm, the first generations, is that several were very upset that Stockholm was not in Spreken art. That Stockholm, I think it was Sappo, or I don't. Some of the olds were like I had a discussion with, and he said, like, Stockholm was just as good as Copenhagen at the time. We should have been in there. But it's, I mean, that's not how you do a book, especially a book where you don't know. I mean, it was to a large extent uncharted territory for them. The book is actually documenting the effects of the previous book by Chalfant and Cooper to some extent, to subway art. So the globalization of graffiti, and I think they didn't know, and they were going around the globe on one trip, and you can't visit every...
I think they never really thought about how much impact that book would have, you know.
And I know that they didn't thought about how much impact subway art would have, because I interviewed Martha Cooper for my dissertation in a chapter that wasn't actually published, and she said that the only concern they had at the time was that nobody wanted to publish the book in the US. And they that was their problem, not that they would eventually leave some people out, or and through its success become such a, you know, it was through its success it became, you know, super influential for all of us in Europe.
Yeah, and now we know, but you know, I also talked to these Berlin guys for the episode 6, for this Berlin episode, and they are all really upset about that book too, because Berlin doesn't really play a role in the book, etc. And there are many cities. They are now complaining that they are not in Spraken art, and
but I guess they, from what I've understood, they went around the globe in a few weeks, and they, I guess there were the Hall of Fame in Märkische Viertel in Berlin, for example, but they seem to have been in the inner city of Berlin primarily. They don't have a very, I remember they have a very critical chapter on Berlin, so I could imagine similar discussions. There's the Turkish B-boys, the Wild Style piece, and what else is it? It's not that much in the two. It's a spread, isn't it? If I'm not misremembering. But it's very interesting. I think also, wasn't it also that you had the wall? I mean, the Märkische Viertel Hall of Fame was on the wall, and I think also the other one in the was it in Frohnau? No, that Frohnau is in the south. I remember it was a few years since I did but I remember interviewing some people in Berlin. But I think since you had so much of the wall, and people in the scene knew where the Hall of Fame was, there wasn't that much graffiti in other areas, from what I've understood at least. And that's also something that when I looked at the US and English newspaper material, it's this very polarized picture of the graffiti scene or they wouldn't report it as a scene, but the graffiti phenomenon rather in Berlin. It says, because I searched for Berlin and graffiti, and there is all of these articles on the graffiti on the Berlin Wall, and then there are all these articles that says, oh, it's so wonderful, there is no graffiti in the city at all, anywhere. So it's like this kind of like, it's almost like, I guess the wall functioned as a kind of like magnet for much of the graffiti.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly how it was. Yeah. He actually said why we should paint in the streets or somewhere when you have such a long wall.
Yeah. Such a long wall, which is also so flat and perfect concrete. Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably also the reason why that Stone and Neon, they went to Berlin in '86. That's what they say in season 1, right? Yeah. Everyone says that Berlin was pretty much clean, and it was just a Berlin Wall with some graffiti on it. Yeah, at least a lot of graffiti.
A lot of graffiti, but not that much.
And it was really mixed, right? Yeah, so much graffiti from different kind of cultures, right? Yeah, and backgrounds.
Yeah. It's super interesting that the most spread picture of style writing graffiti, in the sense of style writing, is actually, in the material I've gone through, is actually that piece by Great bass partner, which was done at Brandenburger Tor back in early November 1989. So
this is so crazy. It's incredible.
But from what I've seen on the documentation of the Berlin Wall at the Brandenburger Tor, there was no pieces there, probably because it was such a heavy surveillance during a lot of the time, and it wasn't probably possible to actually paint at that place until the very last weeks of the Berlin Wall as a border, as the German-German border.
I'm actually really excited to hear the story, the great story about this wall.
Yeah,
we should ask him. Yeah, because
I've interviewed him 2 times actually on it.
Ah, okay. So what was the proposal? He just went there and without knowing what happened.
No, he didn't have any idea. And there's actually a YouTube clip where you can see him paint, because there's somebody who just made a home recording and they've uploaded it. I can send it to you. It's quite interesting. And he said they didn't have any specific idea. They were there for like a 3-day trip, and since they were writers, they wanted to do something on the Berlin Wall, and they were tourists, so they wanted to see the Brandenburger Tor. So they went there, and then we could paint here. Why not? And they painted, and he said that there came a West German border police and said that they could be arrested. But he couldn't arrest them, but that the Grenzpolizei could arrest them. But nothing happened. But he said there was a lot of turmoil. There was a demonstration going on, and he said that one very drunk guy jumped up on the wall and started peeing into the east side, and him they arrested. I think he said, like, as long as you didn't jump the wall and started peeing on the police, then they didn't do anything at the time. And wasn't it? I think it's the same day as it is the big demonstration on Alexanderplatz in East Berlin also. So it's, I think it was November 3rd or 4th. I checked out the exact date, but I could send you he sent me a link and I can send it to you as well. It's kind of cool. You can see them paint. And he's on several postcards, and he was in, that piece is on several different postcards, and it was, in several of the news clippings, November 9th, you can see the piece. And the funny thing is that they did, the piece they did said "Peace on Earth," which is kind of symbolical, but it was actually their crew. It was POE, Peace on Earth. So it wasn't actually a message. But he said, okay, they did understood that it was a message at the same time as it was their crew. Yeah. But you should interview him. He's a very talkative person.
Very interesting, yeah. We also have this photo in the episode, so I was wondering about the story of that piece, So it's very interesting.
Yeah.
But actually, why did you pick the graffiti writing on the Berlin Wall for everything you, especially for your PhD, right?
Yeah.
What was the reason for picking that story?
I thought it was interesting in a sense that, I think the very anti-graffiti laws that came, I think most of them also came after. So I was just interesting, even if there were different discourses in a sense, the style writing and I think that it still had an impact on the more general discourse on graffiti. That was the idea. And it was also interesting, I think it was Tobias who got me into it. Tobias Barrington Lindblad, who is my old friend, he actually made an exchange semester as a high school student in Berlin in the spring of 1990. So he sent me a lot of postcards and stuff. So I was following it already then, and together we discussed how important the idea of the graffiti on the Berlin Wall was for a larger. So I think that was one of the reasons why I decided to do it, and also it was also very appealing in a zero tolerance context to see how a mainstream discourse could be hailing graffiti, and also the bizarreness of some of the quotes. Like one of my favorite quotes that I often use when I teach, when I talk about it, it's one of the, I think it's a Canadian newspaper, or if it's a US newspaper, I don't remember, but it says like, the Berlin Wall is a monument to urban graffiti in the East, where you cannot reach the wall so easily, and of course not express yourself freely through spray paint. The wall is clean and gray. So the indirect idea is that you can actually paint the subway in New York freely, which is of course not the case. At the time, it was the war on graffiti in New York. So it's just at this specific place where it becomes this kind of like, almost like a what do you call it in English? Space of projection for your own idealized self-reflection. We are free and we accept things. But you would not accept graffiti. They didn't accept graffiti in the subway. I mean, so it's interesting in that sense how the public discourses on graffiti collides. There are other people writing about graffiti who really don't like graffiti, who says that one quote is something like, this is the ugliest monument in the world. The Berlin Wall is probably the only place that is where you can do graffiti without it becomes uglier. And then there are other quotes who are like, okay, the wall is beautiful but frightening, and the graffiti is ugly but calming. So there's all these different kind of logics that kicks in that I thought was interesting. I don't know if I told you, a part of the PhD project was that I collected postcards on Berlin Wall for several years. Okay. So I have, I think, about 110 or 120 postcards, and there's quite a lot of super interesting stuff in these postcards, and almost all of them have graffiti on them, even if, I mean, not all of the Berlin Wall was painted. And
how many postcards is this? How many postcards?
About, like, I think,
in numbers?
Around 100 postcards. So it's I mean, of course there's many other postcards, but I was collecting for a while, and all of them are different. So my wife.
It's a nice exhibition.
Yeah, it's a nice little exhibition. I did an article on them in Swedish just a few weeks ago, actually. I have an idea of making it into an English version. It's kind of a popularized version of my Berlin chapter. But and I used some of the postcards as a material in this one, so I could send you some pictures. I think it's perhaps, I don't know if you use pictures with the pod, but
we have a YouTube version, Spotify, and the iTunes version. But in the YouTube version, we can show photos. Yeah. When we left, I think a few months later, maybe it was late summer or something, I just followed a thread on your Facebook page, on your personal Facebook page, about a wall that has started to be removed or something with like roller paint.
Yeah, it's the piece called Highway by the the graffiti crew Schoff, who were, I mean, they were respected, but not one of the major crews in Stockholm. But they did a piece. They made a bunch of pieces in the late 1980s, and then they made one big piece called Highway in the summer of 1989. It was a summer when there was several other pieces made. There was the Fascinate piece in Spånga by Circle and Tarek, and there was the Red Dragon that you had in the program. And they were all made in the summer of 1989. So and they are all these three pieces are still left and have been left more or less untouched for 30 years. And then one morning during one day, the owner of one of the walls started removing it by painting blue paint. Fortunately, some neighbors saw him and started shouting and made him stop. And I saw it in the news, actually. So it actually made the news quite early.
Wow.
And I posted the post that I guess the one you saw, and I, a little bit upset, And I wrote about that piece when I was doing my undergraduate art historical studies. So I had interviewed two of the artists. So I was kind of shocked, and also shocked by my own reaction, and by my own shock, and also by the reactions of a lot of other people. But I wrote something angry on my Facebook and my Instagram, and I thought it was gone. I didn't know that they had stopped the removal. And then when I found out, a friend called, and he was like, "Who is an old writer? I know him from the 1980s, but he's also a painter, educated in cultural historical painting renovation." So he said, "I know we can get rid of the paint. Let's go to Rågsved, where the painting is at." So I was like, "Wow!" A little bit again. I was preparing, for the autumn semester, but again, I was like, I have to leave the ivory tower. I have to go down. And I must say, I mean, I've been doing graffiti. I've been writing about graffiti, but I have not been renovating graffiti before. It was quite it was an interesting, but it was also super heartwarming to see the kind of like local engagement in the question. I mean, there were several people who came and helped us. There was a few writers who came. I mean, Sappo came, for example, and a couple of other came by, but there was also the local community. I mean, this piece have been in a very central part of this suburb for 30 years. It's one of the main artworks. So there was really a heartwarming engagement, and there was. But we didn't manage to restore it, but we managed to get away some of the blue paint. And unfortunately, right at the moment, nothing else has happened. We've been in contact with a conservator, a paint conservator, who said that most likely she would be able to restore the piece. Because when you had a legal job in Sweden, I think it was probably the same in Germany. People usually wanted the best paint, and the best paint at the time was Auto K, the German car paint, and that paint. Multona, but I think they did the Multona and the Belton. I think it was the same company, but the car paint had a very, very good durability. So it's made out of different chemicals than the wall paint we use today. So she said that probably we will be able to remove the paint, not get it back to the original, shape necessarily, but at least get the painting back. But the owner of the wall don't want to spend any money, or even he doesn't even want to give the permission to actually take away the paint, which we need. We need the permission from the owner. I think he hopes that it would eventually blow over, and then he can remove the whole painting, and so you don't have to worry about it. Because it's of course much cheaper if you're a real estate owner who wants to earn as much money as possible, is to have a not have a big artwork, but have a clean, simple wall.
When I thought that, I remembered that one wall that we filmed with Dizzy and Lars.
Oh yeah.
This very drunk this wall that said "very drunk" from 1985, I think.
Yeah.
And when we looked at the wall, we also were wondering a little bit, like, because they renovated the whole building a bit earlier, I think, and it looked like they kept the graffiti there.
Yeah, it's very possible.
But it's a very random piece, actually. It's no one really knows who painted it and stuff, right?
No.
So
I think Sappo. I spoke to Sappo about it. He said he knew who had done it, but I hadn't seen it actually before you showed it to me. So it's interesting for me. It's not a part of the official graffiti history like Red Dragon or Highway or Fascinate, but it's obviously a case of a very, very early piece. But I think also we have in Sweden, I don't know if you're the same in Germany, we have even on a linguistic level this kind of split of graffiti into graffiti and klotter, which I think the zero tolerance was not officially a zero tolerance on graffiti. It was a zero tolerance on klotter, which, I mean, in English would be graffiti vandalism. So I think that a lot of people don't mind graffiti pieces that much. That's what they see as graffiti. So I think even throughout zero tolerance, I think especially for a lot of people who were doing graffiti exhibitions, for example, they were quite shocked when they realized what they could and could not do, because they thought that they were doing quite harmless things. So that's why I think, I mean, actually graffiti paintings have never been that stigmatized in Sweden. So I think it's very possible that a landlord would renovate and keep a painting like that. Yeah. So, but I think that the highway wall, I think, to be honest, the wall itself, not the piece, but the piece to some extent the piece as well. But the wall is in quite bad condition, so it would probably need some kind of renovation. And of course, if you have to renovate a wall with a graffiti mural on it, or you have to renovate a blue wall, it's probably much cheaper to renovate a blue wall. And so that's probably why he want to get rid of it. Not because of not because that he don't like graffiti necessarily.
Do you saw that the completely renovated Odem piece in Berlin?
No.
That I think Inca renovated old Odem piece from 1993, I think.
Cool. No, I didn't see it. That sounds cool.
Yeah. So what you basically think about this painting renovation in graffiti? I mean, most of what people paint in like 40 years is not forever. So, and now more and more people start to renovate graffiti from back in the days. What do you basically think about it?
I mean, I have a little bit mixed feelings, but I think that, I mean, if we keep a few pieces, I think that's very, very good. And it's not really up to us only. But I'm not sure renovating pieces is the right way to go. I mean, I think it's, and I'm not sure. I mean, of course, if this is, I mean, it sounds like a beautiful story, but I think it's important that we keep. I mean, we keep some of the artifacts. I mean, graffiti is, at least in Sweden, it has been one of the most up to debated art forms, and it will be very strange if we only have photos left. Photos are, you know, important, but photos don't give you the full picture. It don't give you the bodily experience of a graffiti piece. But I think renovating, it should be done by professional renovators, and it shouldn't be, and I think it will never be, it's not a problem because it will never be most of the writers or most of the pieces that are renovated. There will be a few, because, I mean, in most cases, this solves itself because the pieces are usually painted over with an. I mean, I think we have a system which reminds a little bit about in graffiti, which reminds about buildings, but in a shorter time frame, so that, you know, when something is modern and new, you would never, you know, take it away. But when something is old and not anymore modern, but yet not old enough to represent anything than just being unmodern, then it's usually painted over. And then, but by various reasons, sometimes by chance, sometimes by respect, I think some pieces are left. And I think what we should do is try to get mainstream society to also take a kind of responsibility for the preservation of such objects. I mean, I took myself, together with Tobias Parentin Lindblad, who I worked with for many years with Underground Productions, we suggested that Highway, Fascinate, Red Dragon, and a fourth piece, Midsummer Madness, should be landmarked, officially landmarked, so that the unofficial landmarking, the subcultural landmarking, in a sense, should be made official. And I think it would be a good development. It's, of course, not good for all paintings, but it wouldn't happen anyway. And it's not necessarily for the writers. I think it's for the larger society. I mean, and the forthcoming societies. We keep a lot of things in museums and other places that were not meant to last, but nevertheless they say something, or perhaps sometimes a lot, about a certain time and place.
Yeah. I mean, also I think that the look of such a wall from back in the days and to now, when you see how Inca does it, for example, with the Odin piece, it looks so different now, right? With the new paint and with everything, you know?
Yeah, I think that's better. I mean, in this case, I think as an artist, I would see it more as a reenactment, as an artistic statement rather than a renovation, because it's a reinterpretation in a sense, perhaps more or less accurate. But I mean, one of my favorite pieces ever in Stockholm, it's not a very famous one. It's at Paradise, and I never saw it when it was new. I took a picture of it in 1997. Then it was 8 years old, and it was just beautiful. And I took the picture, and this was very important for a local part of Stockholm called Nacka. And if you check out the Facebook group Nacka Graffiti, I think they have that piece as the kind of frontispiece, and it's my picture. And then I know the writer a little bit, and he sent me a picture of the original when he took the picture when it was new, and it was so it didn't have this kind of very intense but at the same time mild color setting that I really enjoyed with it. It was much more sharp and aggressive, and I realized, wow, you know, my interpretation, my memory, the piece I loved was not the piece that he actually created back in '89, but rather one that had bleached quite a lot that I saw in 1997. Still, I mean, the piece was still great, but I mean, I'm quite sure that this might also be a problem, that we have pieces now that we have lived with for a long time, and they don't look like what they looked like when they were new. So if you're going to do a renovation, are you going to restore it back to the original shape, if possible? It's not. It might be so that we won't recognize it anymore. So I think most, mural conservators today usually today would rather say that we should try to preserve what it looks like at the moment. So that's what I think. But I mean, this case with the Autumn piece by Inca or the restoration by Inca, it sounds really cool in itself. And as an artist, I think all these different strategies are interesting. But there was a suggestion that one could repaint the blue painted part of Highway, which I was very much not for. But it's a possibility if nothing else could be done. But I think it would be better to restore it.
Coming back to the reason why we had been to Stockholm last year, and you actually said you watched the episode, the Stockholm episode, which is episode 3 of the new series.
I watched the BBC and the Stockholm episode because those two were in English already in the German version around Christmas.
I mean, they are now out with English subtitles, so you can watch all of them.
Next week, I will watch it.
And what is? I mean, for you as one of the people who really know a lot about Stockholm and Swedish graffiti, what is your feeling about the episode about Stockholm? And
no, I mean, I think it was 13 minutes, I think, or something like that. I mean, of course, you can't get all of the nuances of 35 years of history into 13 minutes, but considering the 13 minutes, I thought was super interesting. It was following the main persons in the scene, except perhaps Sappo would have been one that could have been. He was very important, but Dizzy and Siggy were the main guys they were the kings in Stockholm throughout the 80s, and Puppet was also a great artist, and he also represented another city, so I thought it was interesting. I thought it was I enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed the 2 previous seasons, seen a lot of things that, I mean, some of the things I knew, some of them I did not know at all, and some of them I had a kind of new aspects of. And I think it's so important to see writers themselves get the possibility to speak and tell their story.
Thank you. I mean, what it's really hard to transport, in my opinion, is, I mean, when we met Ziggy and Dizzy, especially Dizzy, Ziggy as well, but Dizzy he's still so addicted to graffiti. It's crazy. It's incredible, how addicted both of them still are to graffiti and how they talk about it and blah blah, and etc. This is something that you not really hear from the younger generation, It's a whole different interview when you talk to someone who started maybe in the mid 90s or something to those guys, and they are now all going straight to the 50s now.
Yeah. I remember I'm also following the early hip hop scene, and I was on this kind of old school reunion, and it was super interesting. Several of the very first from the hip hop scene were in the debate and in the panel discussion. 2 writers, a few dancers, and DJs. There wasn't that many. I don't know if there were any old school rappers. On the other hand, there were not that many. I think that's what's all over Europe. That breaking was the first big thing of hip hop, and then there was graffiti. But all the time there was DJs. But the rap scene didn't really started booming until a little bit later. But I remember listening, and they were. I mean, many of them expressed a little bit of sorrow for not being acknowledged by the younger generations. but I think that, I mean, in general, there are, you know, a lot of admiration. I mean, it's dependent on how much you expect admiration for pioneering. But I remember in the end, I think this was 2000 and let's say if it would have been 2019, it wasn't, but that was 35 years since 84 when style wars were shown, etc. If I was saying to them, well, if you would have been 14, 15, 16, which most of them were back in 84, if somebody came to them and said, you know, you should have known what happened back in 1950. We were pioneering youth culture back then. You would probably not have listened too much. So it's in a sense, I mean, it's obvious that younger generation have to make up their own ideas on who are the pioneers, and but I think there is a big interest for history within the graffiti context. That's at least, or at least among the younger writers that I meet. But when you're young, history is perhaps not the most interesting thing. But that's perhaps there's a little bit of another thing than the passion with the writers such as Sigge and Dizzy. But I think I think it was for many of the first generation of writers, it was such a life-changing experience. I mean, it was for me as well. So that's why we care so much about it and we are engaged.
When somebody asks you today about where are basically the roots of everything we are talking here right now, I mean, are you always telling them the story of the subway art movement? There's so many answers I have heard the past 20 years. What is your answer? I mean, when talking about the roots of graffiti writing, like the culture we are talking about.
I mean, there is several different ways of answering that question, of course, but I mean, there is obviously, I remember there was graffiti before graffiti in the sense that we talk about it today. But I think it was super important that it came with a larger packet and gave it as a kind of a subcultural framing with music, with the dancing, and with and all of that was super important, at least for many of the first generation writers. So that's one. But I mean, I know that there were people writing, doing throw-ups, for example, bubble letters already in the 70s. There was one guy who were called Benny. I think I would say that he was a quite up bomber in Sweden in the late 70s, early 80s. He made a specific cartoon. And it did different things. It said like Benny wanted to live, in a sense of Benny vill bo. It was one big piece in along the train line that I remember seeing as a kid, and I took a picture of another small Benny character. Benny trivs. Benny enjoys himself. That's kind of like, so that kind of graffiti did exist in the before the kind of graffiti. We also had a movement called the so-called Brigade Painters, who were inspired by the painting brigades of Mexico. Working politically, and they painted in the late 70s. But it was a quite short-lived moment. So, I mean, as a cultural identity, I would say it's 83, 84, and it's with the kind of history that we get from New York through movies such as Style Wars or Beat This, a hip-hop history, and similar So that's, I would say, that informs the cultural identity. But on the other hand, of course, it's more complex than that. And it's
a short question, and
several different possible answers.
Especially as you know much, you pretty much know about the Berlin Wall, what happened. Let's say in the early '80s on the wall, who painted there, like Richard Hambleton, for example, right? Those artists probably came at the same time as the New York graffiti subway artists, right? But it's about the wording. I think it's a lot about wording. It's a lot about, is this graffiti? Is it graffiti art? What is it? It's really hard to define, right? I mean,
definitely. I mean, but in the material I've been looking at, I mean, it's reported about as graffiti, but it's obviously another what we would say another discourse. So in the autumn of 1987, there was this very, very hectic debate on graffiti in the subway, which was very intense, and it was, full of very, very angry voices on graffiti. And amidst that debate, there is this article on graffiti on the Berlin Wall, and it says the world's longest art exhibition. So it's obviously that the Berlin Wall was something else, but at the same time, I think that these very, very so it's in one sense it's two different things, and I think also a lot of the artists who were painting the Berlin Wall, like Richard Hambleton, and they were a little bit older, and they came from a more. They did another type of graffiti, at least, but it was reported on as graffiti.
People today say that street art came much later, like with Banksy or something. My opinion is that is not true. I believe that the street art movement is had its birth in the 80s, in the early 80s or something.
It's a plausible explanation. I mean, also that you could answer a different way. I mean, the concept street art didn't exist, but there existed artists, and probably more artists than we have previously acknowledged, that were working in this kind of like more experimental sense. But and I even so that's one of the things. But the concept street art wasn't used at the time. So I would say I think that street art. It would be correct to say that it started rather in the late 1990s, and I think it was at a time when there was a hybridization between that kind of art and graffiti, because a lot of the main street artists today have a background in graffiti, and some of them even talk about themselves and what they're doing as graffiti. So it's again, I think it's about cultural identity and pointing out predecessors and informing your work in different ways. I mean, apart from that one, I thought the other one that gained a lot of attention the last few years, but there was this beautiful documentary that's, I think, 13 years ago, the Kronjuvelen, about the punk bomber scene in Holland.
Amsterdam.
So that's, I mean, that's Dr. Ratton, those people who were doing they were actually tagging stylistic tags already before the New York graffiti had come. But again, we didn't know about that in Sweden, and it wasn't a part of the cultural identity. So it was nothing that people related to. But of course, it's possible to see it as a precursor or side track.
Yeah. So it's probably the time where a lot of different cultures clashed in some way, right?
Yeah, of course.
Because as far as I understood, Shu, he has been part of the punk, of those punks who were tagging around in Amsterdam, and then basically changed to this, let's call it a new, graffiti movement that just came like in the 81, 82 or something. That's how I understood him, because he showed us some tags from 79 or 80 or something, and he said basically that this has nothing to do with New York.
No.
So in that way it clashed.
Yeah. So it's dependent how you study it. If you study it as a phenomenon in the streets, you could probably trace it back, further back. I have been interested in age, the idea of age as a factor that could unitify several different graffiti traditions. And I've been looking at mass media representations of graffiti writers. And we actually did an article in Underground Productions, Martha Cooper and I together, with Martha Cooper's pictures. She was actually the one pointing out these postcards of kids writing graffiti from the early 20th century. And I've been able to find other similar, both in text and in visuals, where you point out that kids are doing graffiti, which is seen as a little bit disturbing, but at the same time fun and challenging adult authority through graffiti. And that would be like a way of understanding graffiti as something that again has with cultural identity to do, but cultural identity in a broader sense. So you can find early 20th century postcards of kids writing graffiti, making characters looking like police officers or school teachers, in a way that you can see a kind of like continuity into the subway graffiti in New York and onto, one of the most obvious and common characters is the cop character. So that's you can see that kind of continuity. So then it's another type of understanding when graffiti starts, and based in a kind of like a phenomenon that is based in a differentiation of aging, which is an older way of understanding age, is that you're a kid, you're an adult, and you're old. But during early modernity, we had, and that's early part of the early modernity, we started to talking about aging as talk about 7 ages of man, where juvenility is a part of a specific part of aging, when you're not a kid anymore, but you're not an adult, and that's an area when you're challenging the adults. And you can do that different ways, but one of them would be like disturbing police officers by doing graffiti.
Following up on my question, when I ask you about the roots of the culture, right? How much of an importance do you think the media had back then, like books, movies, etc.? I mean, you can, if you watch the Stockholm episode, it basically starts with the story you telling about Star Wars, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like that was one of the most important media back then, right? This is what we understood. My question is, would you say that, I mean, we have heard that all over Europe, like the subway art and everything. Would you say that media still have this importance that medias had back in the days for the graffiti culture?
I mean, the development of subcultural graffiti media, which didn't exist at the time, that is still important. But the mainstream media, but you got to understand also the kind of like what we talk in media theory as the media landscape. I mean, the possible available media at the time. I mean, Style Wars, at least in Sweden, it was aired, or I should rephrase it a little bit. When we started doing the graffiti magazine, Underground Productions, and we started interviewing the first generations, all of them talked about how important Style Wars had been. And it was almost like I felt after a while, and especially when I read art history, I was feeling, can this really be true? It seems a kind of like self-mythification, but a lot of people could kind of like tell this happened. I saw that. I remember how the Coke went out of bubbles because I wasn't drinking. I was just watching. And I think, but on the other hand, I looked into the TV. I mean, there was less than 12 hours of television that evening in Swedish television at the time. We had 2 channels. They started airing at 5:30 the Friday night, and Style Wars gets up at I think 7:50, which is kind of prime time. I mean, you finish dinner. If you're a teenager and you're home, this is what you're gonna watch. And there was already, that one should remember, there was this kind of like, already people have been doing breakdancing and breaking and electric boogie for a while. So there was a budding hip hop scene. And a lot of people, I think, recorded it because the VCR was starting to get more and more common. So people recorded it. So it circulated throughout the 80s. And I just made a comparison just for fun, because I just had a lecture. Only Swedish, I think there is, depending on how you count, there is between 19 and 21 Swedish TV channels today. And they, more or less all of them, air television programs 24/7. So a Friday night today would mean somewhere between 10 and 15 times as many programs to watch. And that's not counting social media. It's not counting the international networks. It's not counting all the online streaming TV services. So you can just imagine the kind of impact as a well-done, dramatically interesting and appealing documentary could have at the time. It's just so actually, after looking at it that way, I really do believe the old school writers. And I remember myself, I saw it in '89 the first time, and that was a VHS copy. And there was a copy of a copy of a copy or something. So it was black and white and jumping, and we still gathered like 4 or 5 guys at my house when my friend had come across a copy and we could watch it together. So I think it was the kind of like the sparseness of the media landscape is one thing that made it so much more important than it, if Style Wars would go on TV today, it probably would not have the same kind of impact.
The last media or movie that I remember that had such an impact, maybe not such an impact, but had a large impact, already in a time where people consumed movies on YouTube or MySpace or whatever there was this Dirty Hands, right?
Yeah. But I think also the difference is that Dirty Hands had an impact within an already existing cultural structure, rather than creating a cultural structure, which I think was the difference. I mean, Style Wars wasn't the only one. There was other, like Beat This, a hip-hop history, and etc. But I think Style Wars was the one most important one. So I think that's the difference. But I also think that, I mean, what you can see today, there's still these subcultures that were established, between circa 1955 to 1995 are still the subcultures existing today. I mean, have there really been any, in the same sense, really new youth subcultures? I mean, there's been morphings. There have been, definitely developments. But I mean, I think you needed that kind of like very monolithic and sparse media landscape to establish, worldwide global subcultures, which we don't have today. What we have today is a much more differentiated and much more grassrooted in many senses. media landscape. Well, I think it goes two ways. At least in Sweden, we also have this huge, and I think it's the same. There are some things that are bigger than they ever were, like the European Football Championships or the Eurovision Schlager festival, or that kind of things are bigger than ever. But I don't think you have that kind of like one documentary really making an impact and establishing things in the same sense. But I might be wrong. I haven't researched it, and my wife always say that, when I talk about this theory, she always say, well, it's interesting how youth subcultures ceased to exist when you ceased to be a youth. So it's probably, it might be, but I also think I have interviewed a lot of younger writers, and I remember, when I was an active writer, there was nobody except this and Sigge and Sappo who were like 20 or beyond. And now when sometimes, that's a quite young writer, he's just 23. From my perspective at least, I'm just realizing that there are, and the generation gets longer. The first generation, their active years were quite short. My generation, the second generation, I think we were a little bit longer. But the third generation and fourth generation, many of the still leading writers in Sweden, I think, belong to the third and fourth generation, and they started in the early to mid 90s. So people doing it for a much, much longer time. And doing it for a long time without having any breaks or making comebacks, because that people also do from the first and second generation.
Yeah, it's both. It's both. Huh? It's some people had a break and then they have a comeback now, and I would say it's most of them actually. Most of the people who are active again these days, like in the 40s or 50s, had a break.
Yeah. I don't think Chaos ever stopped, for example.
No, I think Chaos is the most notorious graffiti writer in Europe. If you ask me.
He might very well be. Yeah. I've seen his stuff since the late 1980s, and I've never seen him not doing anything.
Maybe Sabe too.
Yeah, Sabe might be. And there are a few others. I think Nug has also been doing a lot of things for a long time. And there's probably people there's probably a Chaos or a Sabe in every major city in Europe. But most people make breaks. Yeah. I think it's really difficult to have a longevity, a long career in graffiti writing, especially if you continue doing illegal graffiti, because it's time-consuming and it's quite, tough. It's like is the Wiz in Star Wars, he says that I can't see myself doing graffiti when I'm older, but I will do a comeback or something. What is it he says? So that's the kind of, But I think to return to the question, I think you need the larger package with the hip hop. I think it was super important. I'm always very disturbed today when I hear these kind of, who want to weed out graffiti from hip hop. I think the problem is not. Graffiti is a part of the cultural context we call hip hop. The problem today, I would say, is rather that hip-hop has become more or less synonymous with rap music. And in that way, people feel that they should have an opinion on or listen to rap music. But I'm always like, well, that's not necessarily. There were people listening to a lot of different music. It's not, we never ask nobody would claim that rap music is not hip hop just because that most of the rappers don't care about graffiti anymore. It's still hip hop, and I would say that, I mean, graffiti is a part of the hip hop cultural context. That doesn't mean that an individual graffiti writer necessarily have to identify as a hip hopper. It's another thing.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I actually had a podcast with a hip hop journalist from Germany, a very interesting one, and we talked about it for 2 hours about how much graffiti is in hip hop and the other way. You know, it's a very it's a very interesting.
Yeah, I think I think it's super interesting, and I think the problems are two. I mean, one is this very dogmatic dogmatic understanding of hip hop, which is like 4 elements, kind of like, and the other one is this, that hip hop is actually a part of the music industry, and those two polarities makes it very difficult for a lot of people to identify with hip hop. But I mean, if you look at the early sources, it's not only a media product, even if it was, underscored or emphasized by media, the relationship between rap breaking and DJing and graffiti, but it's not taken completely out of the blue. So you can, I mean, if you look at the earliest academic piece on graffiti, which is, at least as far as I know, Craig Castleman's Getting Up, Subway Graffiti in New York, he doesn't use the word hip-hop a single time in the whole book, and it's published in 1982. However, he talks about a writer called Herc, or even Cool Herc, and talks about him as the size of Hercules. So it's obviously one of the DJs who have been pointed out as the founding father of DJing, but he doesn't know. I mean, he doesn't conceptualize it as hip hop, and he also writes that the most sought after aesthetic quality among writers is the smooth integration of letters called flow, which is the same kind of aesthetic principle that is used within breaking and rapping. I mean, you can have any kind of like contemporary rapper, they would talk about flow. So it's obviously that they share a lot of aesthetic principles, which is not to say that it might have been other aesthetic principles and there might have been other cultural areas that also shared these ones. So that's another question.
Yeah. So Jacob, thank you very much.
Thank you
for your time.
Thanks you for
everything. Have a nice evening.
Yeah.
Talk soon. Bye bye.
Take care. Bye bye.